Hi, everyone. We're working on our Sunday school lesson, and this is for April 5th, so we're getting close to being caught up. This will put us within a week of that. I hope you enjoyed the 7 sayings of Jesus on the cross. That kind of took a lot of my time this week, but I thought it was really beneficial and encouraged me. So we're in 1 Samuel chapter 28, all the way through 2 Samuel chapter 19, and here's some observations I saw when I read through this. The first one was Saul allows his fear to lead him to evil. And we see that a couple of times. It says specifically in chapter 28, verse 5 and verse 20 that he was just terrified and afraid. And what do we know? I noticed was that witchcraft, divination are real. That Bible doesn't say it doesn't exist. It's real. It just says we should stay away from it. And this stuff is evil. And of course, we saw, and you can look at my notes, there's a lot of references to this, that right away we see Saul banishes the witches and the divinators from the land. And then next thing you know, you see him consulting one because God's not hearing his prayers anymore. And we'll look at that in a little bit too. The next section is prayer. And we see Saul prays, doesn't answer. And that's why he goes to this witch or this diviner. And the reason in the passages there that are in my notes, it's because of his disobedience. He just refused to obey God and follow God several times, and so God stopped answering his prayer. Then we also see David praying, and a lot of references to that, and you can look those up if you probably already have it in your study. They'll be in my notes there. One of the things I thought was pretty evident in our section here was David's respect for God's control and timing. The old way to say that was sovereign. That God is the sovereign, or the sovereignty of God. That simply means God's in control of everything. He's holding everything together, you might say. So David's respect for God's control and timing. We see his reference to the Lord's anointed when he doesn't want to lay a hand on Saul, but rather he wants to wait for God's timing on that. And then when he was bringing the ark to Jerusalem, we see him respecting what happened there when Uzzah was killed, and he stops. And then the phrase sovereign Lord in his prayer in chapter 7 of 1 Samuel, we see him using this phrase sovereign Lord, which again is God's control and timing, 7 times in that one section there, which is a lot. Then when he sent the ark back to Jerusalem while he's fleeing from Absalom, because he doesn't want the ark to go with them. It should stay in Jerusalem. And he basically says, if it's God's will, I will go back. So he's respecting God's control and timing on that. And that's in 25 to 26. What's interesting too is he accepts cursing from Shimei. And we see that in 16 verses 5 through 13 and 19, 18 to 23. And his men want to kind of stop Shimei from doing that. He says, hey, if God sent him to do this, then I accept that, because David knew that he had dropped the ball as a leader in sin. And then what's interesting is he doesn't retaliate even when he's back in power, which I thought was pretty interesting. Then we see God fulfills David's promise, and that David's the ruler of Israel. And then I also saw David expresses his honest feelings to God. We see this during the loss, that personal loss. He found strength in God. We see he's angry and afraid at the same time. We see he pleaded with God. And what I thought was really interesting too, this is when the child dies and he's pleading with God for the child's life, his son. He goes and worships God, which I thought was pretty interesting, in chapter 12, verse 20. Even when he didn't get the answer to prayer he wanted, I thought that was pretty good. He still worships God. He goes, first thing he does before he goes to eat, after that long fasting. I thought this was pretty cool. He's weeping at the Mount of Olives, and this is when he's fleeing from Absalom. But of course, this same Mount of Olives is where Jesus wept, was in that area. He was shaken, and then he wept for when Absalom died on chapter 18, verse 33. God gave David victory, and it specifically says that God gave him strength and power to succeed. Chapter 5, verse 10, 8, 6, and 14. Then we see these reverence toward God by Uzzah's irreverent act by reaching out and touching the ark when he thought it was going to fall. Micah was displeased by David's worship, and we see God has a specific comment about that and her ability to conceive later. And then Anon, the rape of Tamar, and just going against God's will on that. We also see David's kindness, and I want to look at that in a little bit. I think this is pretty cool. He shows kindness to Mephibosheth, King Hanun, and his own men that he sent to King Hanun, or Hanun. God's reasons for David not to build him a house, and I want to spend a little more time on that too, but we see he accomplished a lot of stuff without it, deliverance from Egypt. He blessed David's whole life, and he gave Israelites a home. And he didn't ask any of the leaders of Israel for him to build him a house. And God will establish an everlasting house for David. So God turns it around and says, I'm going to build you a house or a line. Of course, we know this is a reference to bringing Christ into the world. And then, of course, we see this section on David's sin and how it wreaked havoc in his life and others. Well, first of all, he wasn't where he was supposed to be. We see that in chapter 11, verse 1. He acted on temptation instead of rejecting it. We see that in chapter 11, verse 2 to 4. When he notices Bathsheba, instead of rejecting the temptation, he doesn't do that. Then he tries to cover it up, chapter 11, verse 6 to 27. And we see that he involves others in it, and this is how sin works. It affects other people's lives. Specifically, Bathsheba and Joab. I don't think Bathsheba or Joab really had a choice because they were the king's servants, and he was the king. The consequences of adultery, murder, and deceit. We see the child dies in chapter 12, verse 14. We see Absalom conspires against David, and then Absalom sleeps with David's concubines, as was predicted by Nathan the prophet. Then we see a reference I thought was interesting to David's wives and concubines. It says he took Michal away from her husband, which was kind of interesting because, he was supposed to marry her at the beginning, but Saul gave her to someone else. So David just takes her away from her husband. And then we see David takes more wives and concubines in chapter 5, verse 13. Then, of course, I like the figures of speech. There's a lot of them. Terror filled his heart, delivered into the hands, took my life in your hands, pleasing in my eyes. Bitter in spirit, swifter than eagles, stronger than lions, must the sword devour forever? This will end in bitterness. Am I a dog's head? Blood be on your own head. That's a very common phrase. We'll see it a lot in the Bible. Deal with me ever so severely, kind of like when you're making a promise or an oath. He lost courage, rid the earth of you. Even the blind and the lame can ward you off, kind of an insult. As waters break out, the Lord has broken out against. Despised him in her heart. Don't take this to heart. Not one hair of your son's head will fall to the ground. Water spilled on the ground, which cannot be recovered, so we must die. No one can turn to the right or to the left, thing the king says. All the hearts of Israel, as a wild bear robbed of her cubs, heart of a lion, heart melt with fear, fell on him as dew settles on the ground, and then will be swallowed up. And so a couple of the things I wanted to point out, and there's a lot here, like I had 3 pages of notes. Just a few things. First is David's kindness to Mephibosheth. This word kindness is the word God describes about himself. This is the loving kindness, unfailing love idea. This word hesed in the Old Testament, beautiful word. 2 Samuel 9, verses 1, 3, 6 through 8, and 13. David asks, is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake? And again, because of his friendship with Jonathan. So they bring this guy named Ziba up, and he asks again, is there no one still alive from the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness? Now, we might think it's kind of annoying that there's all this repetition in the Bible, but it's there for a reason. God's emphasizing this. He points this out twice. Ziba answered the king, there is still a son of Jonathan. He is lame in both feet. When Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David, he bowed down to pay him honor. David said, Mephibosheth, At your service, he replied. Don't be afraid. Now, why would he be afraid? Well, because what you did back then was you'd wipe out your competitor. Anybody that was from the line of the other king, you would kill their whole family off. And he doesn't do that. Instead, he says, don't be afraid. For surely I will show you, here's this hesedness, this kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table. Mephibosheth bowed down and said, what is your servant that you should notice a dead dog like me? Again, he's lame, and he's also related to his grandfather Saul. And he's afraid because that's what normally happened. But God, and David showing God's characteristic here, is gracious. And he hunts Mephibosheth down to love him. The Bible says the same word in Psalms 23 where it says, surely your good and mercy will follow me all the days of my life. It's literally hunt you down is the word pursue. And this is what we see here, this picture that God's love will pursue us just like David's love pursued Mephibosheth. And of course, Mephibosheth didn't do anything to deserve this. In contrary, he was at the wrong side of the royal line there, but David was gracious to him anyway. The other thing I thought was really interesting was David's reasons for David not to build a house for him. I thought this was pretty cool. He said, look what I've accomplished without a house. He's kind of like, why do you want to build me a house? Look what I'm God. I don't need a house to do things. Look at my track record. I thought it was pretty neat. So the first thing he points out is he's accomplished a deliverance out of Egypt without a house. It's like, I didn't need a house back then. Chapter 7, verse 6, I have not dwelt in a house from the day I brought the Israelites up out of Egypt to this day. I have been moving from place to place with a tent as my dwelling. It's kind of like, David, before you were even in your diapers, long time ago, before you even existed, I've been doing things without a house, doing just fine. And then another reason he gives is he's accomplished blessing David's whole life and gave him rest from his enemies without a house. 2 Samuel 7, 8, and 9, and 11, the first part of the verse A. Now then, tell my servant David, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I took you from the pasture from tending the flock and appointed you over ruler for my people Israel. I have been with you wherever you have gone, and I have cut off all your enemies from before you. Now I will make your name great, like the names of the greatest men on earth. I will also give you rest from all your enemies. I love that. God's like saying, look, David, I was in charge of things when you were still back tending sheep. I was the one that made you this great person, and I'm going to make you an even greater person. I'm going to take care of this. And it's kind of cool how God's saying, I'm the one that's going to do this. You don't have to do anything for me. The next part is God's reasons for David not to build a house for him. He's accomplished giving Israel a home so that they would not be oppressed. And he's done this, of course, without a house. 2 Samuel 7, 10, 11a. And I will provide a place for my people Israel and will plant them so that they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. Wicked people will not oppress them anymore as they did at the beginning and have done ever since the time I appointed leaders over my people Israel. I just think it's great that God has things under control, no matter, regardless of what we do, don't do, and what things might seem like. God bless. Until next time, I'll see you then.